Good morning, everyone. My name is Sylvia and I am excited to get started with the first episode of our podcast, Nietzsche and Chill. I am joined today by my wonderful co-host and classmate, Kevin Don. Kevin and I are both MA philosophy students at the University of Edinburgh, and we are excited to introduce you to our first guest, Alex Fisher. Alex, welcome to Nietzsche and Chill.
Brilliant. Thank you both for having me.
Alex is currently a visiting postdoctoral researcher at Tilburg University, funded by the Leverhulme Trust. He completed his PhD in philosophy at Cambridge University in 2024. His research focuses on topics at the intersection of aesthetics, the philosophy of mind, and the ethics of technology. Today, we are going to be diving head-on into one of the most pressing philosophical questions of our digital age. What is the moral and metaphysical status of virtual worlds? Do actions in virtual worlds carry the same moral weight as those in the physical world? Two of the big positions within this debate are the virtual realists and the virtual anti-realists or the fictionalists. Alex, I'd love it if you could just get us started by discussing first, what is virtual realism and virtual fictionalism?
Sure. Recently, people in philosophy and particularly in metaphysics have started looking a little bit about at virtual reality and whether the objects that we perceive within virtual reality exist in any sense. So the virtual realist position says that virtual objects do exist because they are reducible to digital objects. So the bits and bytes that are on the computers that generate these displays in virtual reality. By contrast, the virtual anti-realist or fictionalist says that objects in virtual reality don't really exist. They are a bit like fictional characters or fictional objects. They're represented on virtual reality devices, but they don't really exist in the same sense that Sherlock Holmes is represented in novels, but doesn't really exist. You couldn't go out and meet him in real life.
That reminds me a little bit, Alex, and correct me if I'm wrong with this connection here, of Alexis Minon and this claim about non-existent objects and that there could be objects that exist without existence. And I think Sherlock Holmes is a good example of that. And, I think if we asked a lot of people, who's the world's greatest detective, that perhaps that would be the answer. So it would seem, intuitively to me, it seems that virtual objects can exist without having any true existence. And that's really quite interesting.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So Alexius Meinong was a philosopher in the kind of late 19th, early 20th century. And as you say, his main approach was to try and think about non-existent objects. So he had this theory, Meinongianism, which says that there are objects which don't exist. So these objects have being, but they don't exist. So things like Sherlock Holmes are a good example of this. Other examples might be impossible objects. So the round circle, the square circle, for example. There are various objects that we can talk about meaningfully, which are, in some sense, but don't exist. So Sherlock Holmes would be a good example. And yeah, you could have this approach to virtual objects as well. You could say that there are these virtual objects in some sense, we can talk about them meaningfully, but they don't exist, at least not in the same sense as the physical objects we can go out and touch in the real world.
When you're talking about these issues in virtual reality, how do you think that they apply to ethical issues, such as if you're in a video game or you're using some sort of virtual reality setting and a crime happens, whether that be an assault or a theft or extortion of any sort? How do you think the legal implications or ethical implications play in?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting issue. So increasingly we're seeing, as across various forms of technology, new forms of wrongdoing emerging in virtual worlds, right? And in some cases, these are evolved versions of wrongdoing that exist in the physical world. So as you mentioned, example like assault. In other cases, there are new forms of wrongdoing that emerge in digital spaces that we haven't really encountered in the physical world. And as you say, one thought might be that the metaphysics of virtual reality really matters for these ethical issues. So one objection you might make to a fictionalist position is saying something like this: well, if the fictionalist says that what happens in virtual reality doesn't really exist, it doesn't really happen, then how can any of it be wrong? How can you commit wrongs against other people and harm them if none of it exists? And so this is quite a common objection raised against virtual fictionalism, and one that I think we can answer. So I think, in fact, if we look carefully at virtual fictionalism and how we engage with virtual reality, we can still make sense of a lot of the wrongs in virtual reality without saying that what happens within it exists. I think this is similar to things like deepfake images or writing short stories about people. So with deepfake images or short stories, we can represent various content that hasn't really happened, doesn't really exist. But still, generating that content can be wrong in cases. If I write a really nasty short story about my friend, the stuff in the short story doesn't exist. It didn't really happen. But still, it's my writing and generating that representation that can be wrong. The same is true of a lot of the uses of deepfake. So putting people's faces and making it look like they did some action they didn't actually do. The content isn't real, right? Just as in virtual reality, the content isn't real, but still we can wrong people by generating that content. And that's what I want to say about virtual reality. We can wrong people through the content we generate.
My question would be, I guess, so that would be maybe like a moral and ethical question about wrongs and rights. I guess I feel like also there's a governance problem here too, because my question would be, okay, so if we're saying that there is a wrong that can occur within a virtual world, well, who says what's right and wrong within a virtual world if a virtual world doesn't exist? I tried to look back to see where there were some early examples of wrongs occurring within virtual worlds, and I'm not sure if you've heard of the case of Mr. Bungle, which was in 1993, and it predates kind of things like the metaverse. It was called a MUD, right? So a multi-user domain. And in one of these rooms within a multi-user domain called Lambda Mu, this user, Mr. Bungle, deployed what was called a voodoo doll, and it made some users within that virtual room perform actions that would be perhaps morally suspect on other users within the room. And this caused the big question being, well, what do we do about this? Because these people feel wronged by what happened, but was this something wrong? In the end, Mr. Bungle was kicked out and banned from this platform. But then the question then became a question for them, not of what was right and what was wrong in the sense of what occurred, but what's right and what's wrong in terms of who are we to determine what's right and what's wrong within a world that itself doesn't exist.
Yeah, I think this is a really tricky issue, right? So where you have actions within virtual reality that we would consider wrong if they really happened, if they physically happened. So for example, if I went and punched someone in the street, that's clearly wrong and illegal and so on. If I do that in virtual reality, there's no physical harm there, right? They can't feel my fist hitting their face or anything. So is that wrong in the same sense? It seems if it is wrong, it's at least far less wrong than it would be if I physically did it. And so I think we have tricky issues for these kinds of actions where there's some physical aspect to them, such that if we physically perform the action, it would be wrong. And it's unclear whether virtually performing the action is equally wrong, because in some cases, we have actions like this that have similar psychological impacts on victims, even though the action didn't physically occur. So you have people experiencing symptoms of PTSD following horrific virtual experiences where there was no physical impact on them, but the fact that there was this perceptual appearance of something happening can still psychologically impact people in a really significant and long-lasting way. And so in these cases, it's very tricky because we've got the psychological harms without the physical harms. And so it's unclear whether our existing moral theories and our existing laws should apply to these kinds of actions. And in some cases, perhaps we need new laws for new forms of virtual wrongdoing, where the physical aspect is missing in virtual worlds, but it can still be extremely distressing.
Right. And it also seems to me that people, irrespective of the distress level, perhaps they're looking at things in terms of how strong they would object to something morally. What I mean by that is that I don't think that there's many people out there that think that the video game Call of Duty is evil or morally suspect in any way, although it involves mass slaughter of people. However, there was a 2002 video game which was called ethnic cleansing. And in this game, basically a white supremacist would kill people of other races. So people would say, well, that's completely wrong. And intuitively, that does feel wrong, but Call of Duty doesn't. But if both of these things involve acts which are wrong in the real world and are kind of, almost on a level footing in terms of how wrong they are, then how do we account for some things being very wrong still in a virtual world, but some things seeming less wrong in a virtual world?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and this is a puzzle that philosophers have thought about a lot, both in the context of video games and also with virtual reality. So, um, something along these lines is what people call the gamer's dilemma. So this comes from an Australian philosopher, Morgan Luck, and he talks about exactly the kind of uh, two cases that you were talking about. Some actions that we would consider wrong in the real world are fine when you do them in video games, like Call of Duty. Some people object to Call of Duty, but for the most part, we accept that it's not real shooting people in these contexts, so that's all right. Whereas, as you say, other contexts, so the ethnic cleansing game, many other games where there's much more graphic violence, for example, people say, oh well, there's something wrong about enjoying that kind of violence, even though it's just virtual. And so I think the puzzle is to try and explain the difference between these two actions. Otherwise, we have to say that either they're both wrong or they're both okay. And both of those options seem tricky. We don't really want to say that Call of Duty is really bad, but we also don't want to say that the ethnic cleansing game is morally okay because it's not real. So the challenge is to identify a difference between the two. And so various answers have been offered by philosophers. One that I find quite compelling is that um, comes from Stephanie Patridge, an American philosopher, and she talks about certain actions being incorrigible. The idea being that certain actions, when you virtually perform them, can't be separated from their real counterparts. Whereas other virtual actions, we can treat very differently to how we do their non-virtual counterparts. So we're quite used to, from film and games, to the idea of uh, shooting combatants and especially in games and doing that ourselves. Whereas in the ethnic cleansing game, we struggle to separate the act of virtually doing that from the real action that it originates from. And so we're a bit more squeamish about these incorrigible actions that we can't separate in this way. So to some extent, it's contextual and it's quite contingent which actions we treat in these different ways. But that's one explanation of the difference.
Interesting. Incorrigibility of action aside, do you think that there could perhaps be something that's down to the sophistication of the user themselves? So, for example, I would say a non-sophisticated user would be someone that is using something for the first time and really isn't able to separate the difference between what's real and what's not. A little bit like sometimes people are maybe in a car for the first time and see an object coming up in the rearview mirror, a duck. But that only really happens once, right? And then they say, okay, that wasn't a real object coming up there in the mirror. And then they've learned they may have now become a sophisticated user of the system. Could it be that we're relying on people becoming sophisticated users in order to know the difference between what's right and wrong in a virtual world, and that for non-sophisticated users, it will remain a little bit murky?
Yeah, I think this is a really good distinction. And I think it's very helpful for some of the ethical issues in virtual reality. So some of the harms of virtual reality come through these kinds of almost cases of deception where we're kind of tricked by virtual reality and we get really into it. We take what we're seeing as real. So you often get this, if you Google it, you can find lots of videos of kind of old people trying virtual reality for the first time and kind of freaking out when there's a zombie running towards them because they think it's actually happening. Whereas, after a while of using the technology, you get used to it, you start to understand that what's happening isn't real. What I think is really interesting about virtual reality, though, as a technology, is that even when it doesn't trick us cognitively, we're not deceived by virtual reality, it still tricks us psychologically in certain ways. So even when users are aware that what they're seeing isn't really there, we still have these cases of significant emotional distress from virtual reality. Even when you know that what's happening isn't real, your body reacts as if it were. So a really good example of this, I think, is this VR experience of walking along a plank where you put on the headset and it looks like you're kind of 200 stories up, walking along a plank, kind of big drop either side of you, when in reality, you're just walking on a plank about this far off the ground, right? And so you know that you can't fall. It's just an illusion. You're not really about to fall to your death, but you still can't shake the illusion that the virtual reality is presenting. So I remember trying this experience, and you know that you can't fall off, you could just step forward, but you can't bring yourself to walk along the plank as if you're in no danger, even though you cognitively know that there is no danger. So this is quite similar to other cases of kind of belief discordant reactions, like phobias, for example, where you know that the spider can't harm you, but still you're terrified by it. I think this is what's really interesting about virtual reality, to the extent that even for the more sophisticated and experienced users, there's still something that can deceive us psychologically, even when we know that what we're experiencing is not real.
Alex, to bring this back to moral and ethical dilemmas, you draw a distinction in your paper on interactive fiction between work true and branch true. And this can be useful in evaluating the ethics of virtual actions because you define branch true as being if you have to perform the action in order to proceed to the next level of the game. And so if you're using a game like ethnic cleansing, is the fault on the developer of the game or on the people actually playing the game, which carries more moral weight? How do you think that branch true and work true distinction play into that?
Yeah, so I think in everyday life, when we're thinking about ethics, we care not only about what actually happened, but also what could have happened and what else you could have done, right? This is why debates about free will are very significant for moral philosophy, right? If we don't have free will, that potentially has a significant impact on how we think about ethics. And I think something similar is true in the case of virtual actions. So a lot of video games, for example, give you massive choice as to how you'd like to act, and the same is true in virtual reality. Other experiences are far more constrained, and you kind of have to perform certain actions to proceed within them. And which of the two a particular action is clearly morally significant, right? If you go out of your way to perform some horrible action, that's on you. If the developers, they didn't program it in that you had to do this thing, that seems far more my moral responsibility for performing that action in a way that in a certain game, in Grand Theft Auto 5, for example, you have to torture a character to proceed through the story. And so to some extent, I think that minimizes my moral responsibility. I didn't go out of my way to torture this character. If we think there's anything morally wrong with virtually torturing people at all, it's at least diminished in this case, where I kind of had to do that to proceed through the story. I think there's a further really interesting question about, so there's the thought there that, well, I could always just stop playing. And I think that's interesting for the responsibility here. The fact that I could have just stopped engaging at this point, how does that affect the morality? But just in general, I think whether something is a work truth, and so it's kind of, you have to perform this action to proceed, or whether it's a branch truth and you've gone out of your way to do it, I think is clearly very ethically significant when assessing the morality of a particular virtual action.
Do you think that gamification diminishes the moral responsibility then? So in the sense that, so there's a philosopher in the University of Utah, C.T. Wynn, who writes about value capture. I'm sure you've heard of this. And I guess what we're saying is that, it's when we've got this sort of subtle, nuanced values of an agent being captured and maybe simplified. And in the sense of, you're talking about Grand Theft Auto 5 and having to torture a character in order to continue, you're right. We do have the option to not continue playing the game. However, it would seem that we've actually been value captured and our actions have been gamified because now they've been replaced. Our own values have been replaced and diminished by the values that have been placed on us by the designer of the game, who knows that the gamification process means that we will strive for the completion of this, irrespective of the moral questions involved.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think this applies to much more than video games, for example, right? All kinds of societal elements are becoming gamified in this way. So think about social media, for example. As you say, you kind of start out with these rich kind of more subtle values. I want to meet new people and learn new things and so on, connect with friends, and you end up just valuing the amount of likes you get on your posts, right? You kind of become corrupted in this way. You had these rich values and they become these far more simple, easily quantifiable values. And I think there's a lot to be said about the kind of ethics of nudging in these cases. I think even though you're not being forced to take a particular path and so on, your kind of choice architecture is being shaped in a certain way to push you towards certain actions. And so I think in the Grand Theft Auto example, something similar might be true in terms of diminished moral responsibility. Even if you don't have to perform a certain action, it might be you might be pushed towards performing that action to progress in the game, for example. So I think in a lot of games there are cases like this where people maybe not don't cheat, but employ exploits within games that make other players' lives pretty miserable so they can beat them and progress further through the game. And we started out with these kind of rich values in games of, having fun, meeting friends, enjoying our leisure time. And we come to adopt this kind of pursuit of winning to the detraction of everyone else's enjoyment of a product. And so, yeah, even though we're not forced to take that action, a lot of game design is very careful on how it pushes people towards certain actions. And I think we see cases like this a lot where people are nudged towards actions that we might consider ethically dubious in games.
So is it the case, I don't know anything about this, that game designers, do they currently employ ethicists to help them decide about whether or not these things are right or wrong? It would seem to me that the further we progress in time, we obviously have a strong case if we look at how video games were in the 70s and how realistic they are now, that, in another 50 years' time, they may be completely indistinguishable from reality. And therefore, there could be some kind of obligation upon the designer to maybe involve some ethicists in that. Is that something that you know about that currently goes on, or is it something that you think should happen? Or are you of the belief that, well, if we did that, we may be removing the free will component within the game?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think at the moment there's a lot of ethical consultation that goes on various issues within games, like many other media. So, for example, around the representation of various groups and so on. What I think's interesting is, as you suggest, something that might be more unique to games in this, in terms of the experiences that are presented. I think this is certainly something that happens a lot in virtual reality uses, where virtual reality spaces are contain a variety of kind of persistent issues, especially gendered harms, where people harass female presenting users, for example, perform various kinds of troubling actions. And I think it is something that designers of virtual reality spaces need to increasingly think more about. I mean, I think in general, digital platforms are to some extent behind the times on dealing with some of these persistent issues that target especially minority groups and make them feel unsafe on these platforms. I think something's very similarly true of dating apps, for example, where again there are significant harms that increasingly are coming under the microscope, and these platforms are being forced to address. So yeah, I think in the case of virtual reality, that's true as well. There are new harms that are going to arise in these cases, and often ones that we might not think about in advance, right? So all of the harms that are currently now being raised for deepfakes, a lot of the initial focus was on this will undermine political processes. You won't know whether this video of a politician is true. So this is obviously a significant concern, but the main worry that I've seen about deepfakes now that they're common is, again, the kind of gendered harms as people make deepfakes of female celebrities and make it look like they're doing various things that they haven't actually done. And this was, to some extent, not one of the key issues that was raised initially with deepfakes. I think this just illustrates that with these technologies, there are often harms that we don't foresee. And I think there's a really big role for philosophers and ethicists to play in pointing out these harms and trying to make progress towards mitigating them.
When you talk about these issues where someone is targeted, perhaps based on gender or race or some other element that makes them some sort of a minority. How do you think that should be weighted when that crime occurs in virtual reality versus in the physical reality? What are they the same if there's an issue that is clearly a hate crime, someone is clearly being bullied online or put into a situation where they are truly they meet the legal definition of what being hate crimes would look like? How is that weighted differently?
Yeah, so I think in certain cases, we shouldn't weight it differently at all. I think if we look at how we treat various actions on the internet, often we treat things in exactly the same way as if they were done in the real world. So think about something like hate speech. Hate speech is kind of medium invariant, we might say. It doesn't matter whether you perform hate speech by physically saying it. It doesn't matter whether you do it over the phone, whether you do it, you type out those words on the internet. The medium doesn't really matter, right? It's the words are what matters in this case. And I think so. Hate speech in virtual reality, I think should be treated in exactly the same way as through other media. I think the same is true of other actions. So extortion, for example, doesn't matter how you do it, extortion's still extortion, whether it's over the phone, by email, in person, in virtual reality, the medium doesn't matter. And so I think the same thing's true of things like sexual harassment, for example. Various actions like this, bullying is the same. It doesn't matter how they happen. What I think is different to that is the case of actions that have some physical component and harm. So the case of assault, for example, I think is potentially something that we do need to treat quite differently in virtual reality, where the physical element is wholly absent, at least in current virtual reality, where we don't have, or at least it's not common to have the kind of haptic elements that give you that physical element. So yeah, so I think there's kind of roughly two approaches to harms in virtual reality. One is to treat them along the same lines as we do non-virtual harms, and I think we do this with the internet all the time. The other approach is that certain actions have a physical element, such that even when we don't have that physical element, there still might be something harmful, but in a very different way to how the non-virtual action would be. And those are the cases where I think potentially we need new laws to be introduced around these actions, because they're quite subtly different and importantly different from the physical version, but still seem to me to be wrong in such a significant way so as to potentially warrant legislation. And we've seen this in the last few years. In the UK, various laws have been introduced around digitally mediated forms of harm. So in the UK, there were recently laws passed on upskirting, for example. The same is true of in the EU of deepfake pornography is increasingly coming under regulatory scrutiny. And I think these are the kinds of examples where we need to start having these new legal approaches to these kinds of actions that are similar to non-virtual actions, but importantly different.
And when it comes to talking about these actions and non-virtual actions, I think it leads nicely into whether or not a virtual object can be a subject of theft. You were talking about legislation there coming in on deepfakes. I'm aware that in the Netherlands in 2009 and 2012, there were court cases that came up about the theft of virtual objects. In 2012, it was the Supreme Court in the Netherlands that ruled that virtual objects are real objects and can be stolen. So, I mean, that brings us back right almost to the beginning again to talk about Meinongianism and say, well, how can a non-existent object be stolen if it doesn't exist, right? Or if it doesn't have existence, and what you think that means and where you think ultimately we'll end up with that, because it would appear to me that a virtual object can just be replaced like for like. I did see a video recently, I don't know if you've seen it, of a gentleman that had, some kind of virtual object that he'd built up over time. And I think his girlfriend, in a rage had deleted it or something like that. And he just went off on one, trashing the room. But ultimately, the virtual platform itself gave him that item back. So I guess my question would be, if the item can just be rematerialized, not from the person it was stolen from, but from the company that it created it or gave it out, then really what do we have to worry about a virtual object being stolen?
Yeah, so I think this is a very interesting puzzle. And my colleague in Tilburg, Nathan Wildman, and Neil MacDonald in Glasgow have written about this, a really interesting paper. They call this the puzzle of virtual theft, which is that, as you say, if virtual objects don't exist, as I've been suggesting, and Neil and Nathan think as well, then how can they be stolen? As you say, the Dutch Supreme Court ruled that in this case so it was two boys, they coerced a third boy into giving them a virtual amulet, relinquishing control of the virtual amulet. And the Dutch Supreme Court ruled that was theft. But then if virtual fictionalism is true and virtual objects don't really exist, then surely there's nothing to be stolen, right? So how do we make sense of this? So I think this is a very interesting puzzle. And the solution that Neil and Nathan give is that while the virtual object doesn't exist, right, the virtual object, the amulet, is merely imagined, there is some underlying digital object on the computer that does exist, right? So there are various bits and bytes, physical processes on the computer that do constitute the virtual object. And that stuff does exist, even if the virtual object doesn't. And so control over those physical bits and bytes can be taken by coercion and therefore can constitute theft. So even though the virtual item itself doesn't exist, what they call the prop that underlies it does. And that's the thing that can be stolen and be coerced into giving up. And so that's how I think virtual fictionists should make sense of these cases of theft. And I think something is true of the ethical stuff that I was mentioning earlier, where again, the virtual action of me assaulting someone in virtual reality, that didn't really happen. But a lot of stuff did happen. Me making certain gestures, me pressing certain buttons on my controller. And that's the stuff that we can moralize about and say is ethically wrong, even though the virtual action that was represented in virtual reality, that doesn't really exist. That didn't really happen.
And so I guess my question is going to be, maybe to round all of this very interesting conversation off, is that, we've been talking about ethics and morals in virtual worlds this whole time. And I guess that is completely contingent upon us believing that moral nihilism is not true. So my question would be that if we were moral nihilists and perhaps took the view that morality was just contingent upon humanity itself deciding what was right and wrong, then that would still leave us with a kind of what now problem. So how would you say that we would solve a what now problem for wrongdoing within virtual worlds if one were a moral nihilist?
Yeah, so I think this is interesting. I mean, I think part of what I've been trying to say is that I think the metaphysics of virtual reality is distinct from the ethics of virtual reality. So some people, as I mentioned at the beginning, think that you can only make these ethical claims about virtual reality if you say that it exists. And I've tried to say that I think the metaphysics is independent from the ethics. No matter what you say about the metaphysics, you can still make sense of the ethics. And so I think this is wholly consistent with the kind of moral nihilist view that you're suggesting. I think we should be free to think about the ethics of virtual reality independent of what we want to say about its metaphysics, right? So we can adopt a more nihilist view, we can adopt a realist view, we can adopt any meta-ethical view I think we like about virtual reality, and we should be free to do so. And I don't think we have to be constrained by these metaphysical debates about what exactly are virtual objects and are they real and are they mind independent and so on. I don't think we have to worry about these things. I think we can just think about the ethics of virtual reality as it is and stop being distracted by the metaphysics. And I think, as I've suggested, the ethics of virtual reality is really complicated, right? And I think it's helpful if we don't have to do this metaphysics first. The ethics of virtual reality is as complicated as it is, and I think it's a significant societal challenge how we're going to think about these ethical issues. So I think whether we adopt a moral nihilist view, whether a realist view, I think this is all a really interesting question, and this is the right kind of question we should be asking about virtual reality, rather than what is the nature of virtual objects and so on.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so thank you very much, Alex, for your time. If anybody's interested in learning more about Alex's work, we will put some links to his full papers in the description. And thank you very much for your time.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much for having me.